Okay, so welcome back here, part 2 of animal behavior, space and habitat use, um, related in some way, in a number of ways, depending on your mating system, to what we just talked about. But of course, they use space throughout their lives, not just during these sort of one-off or rare events like mating. And it's important to kind of have an understanding of how animals use space when you're trying to manage for them, because it depends on, how much area do you have to manage for? How many different kinds of areas do you have to manage for? All this kind of stuff that really is maybe not intuitive when you first think about it. And the reality is that animals tend to exist on what we call this continuum of space use, right? From very territorial organisms on one end, like a lot of predators are, for example, where they have a defined space and they never, ever, ever leave it, right? To an animal that just kind of goes wherever the hell it wants to, right? Is nomadic, and all of the sort of variations between the two. Territoriality in and of itself is important to kind of keep in mind, because it affects how animals are distributed across the landscape, right? They're not going to be necessarily everywhere. If they require certain resources in their territory and those resources are spread far apart, then the territories are getting big, right? If they're all concentrated, then sometimes those territories might overlap, right? If territories are very, very large, right, it can actually be a population control mechanism, right? There's only so much area, and every animal has to have a territory of certain size, and you can only have so many territories, right? And the way that those things are determined, again, we think back to cost-benefit kinds of stuff. The larger the animal and the more energy it requires, right? So if it requires more calories in the day and it's a large animal, those two things are going to require a very large territory or a large home range if we don't have a specific territory, right? Those are kind of the big two factors. Beyond that, and in fact, honestly, using those two factors, you can do a pretty good estimate of what home range or territory size might be. And it's only under those two categories that things like habitat quality and resource availability that govern that. Now, where this comes into play with management, and particularly with anthropogenic factors here, is that as we go in and we start chopping down forests and putting up roads and stuff, we are breaking their continuous block of territory up into smaller units, right? We are fragmenting their habitat. Okay, and in doing so, we can make home ranges smaller, right? Which can also in turn increase population density, not increase population size, right? We actually often will see population sizes decrease, but we're going to cram them closer together, right? And typically with these sorts of things, habitat fragmentation, males tend to be more affected than females do, okay? Because males tend to have larger home ranges than females. And so they're the ones that are really going to be hit first by the crunch in terms of space. One thing we need to consider when we think about these sorts of management decisions and behaviors and all that kind of stuff is sexual segregation, right? Not common, right? It doesn't happen all the time. It's frequent in birds, right? But not really necessarily in a lot of other animals. We do see it in deer. We see it in some other ungulates. But the idea here is that this is where sexes live in different areas seasonally, right? And they only really ever come together during mating season. Okay. And this can also be social segregation, but typically we think about this in terms of sexual segregation. And one of the interesting things about this is that what's driving this is energy requirements, right? Males, because they have typically larger bodies, they have typically higher caloric requirements. Females will have higher caloric requirements during one very specific time of the year, right, when they're with young. And so as a result, they're kind of driven to find different territories, right? A male might have to pick a place that's a little more dangerous to live, might be more at risk of being preyed upon, simply because the other places don't have sufficient calories available, right? We're also going to experience maybe things that like different population densities in these different habitats. So males might be in a place where they're more at risk of running into a predator, but they're also probably more likely to be spaced apart. Okay, and so they're less likely maybe to be exposed to disease, whereas a female might be in a higher population density area and more likely to be at risk for disease. Okay, and so when we think about these kinds of decisions, we need to know if the animals that we're worried about do sexually segregate or not. And if they do, we need to treat both sexes differently, right? We need to worry about managing for each of those things. And again, depending on their mating system, right, that can be another layer of complexity to add on to that. We talked before about the notion of a meta-population, right, where it's a bunch of smaller individual populations, and individuals from one subpopulation might travel to another one, right, to go from place to place. This is something we need to consider here when we think about behavior and managing for behavior in the context of both dispersal and migration, right? And again, we always treat these two things together because it's individuals leaving their current home range, a current population. The difference is, though, is that dispersal is one way, right? They bought a one-way ticket somewhere, they're not coming back. Migration, they went to their summer home, but they're going to come back in the winter, right? Or vice versa, right? And again, we need to understand these two things and be able to treat them in a management context, because dispersal is how meta-populations work, right? We've always got source populations and sink populations, and sink populations always need dispersal. If they don't get dispersal, if they don't have immigration, they die off, right? And so we need to make sure that we're connecting these individual subpopulations within a meta population for that reason. We care about it with migration because that means that for the same animal, we have to manage two different areas, or maybe more different areas, right? If we're trying to manage for monarch butterflies, and I wouldn't recommend doing it in Mexico right now because those guys are getting shot because their monarch butterfly territories happen to be where drug kingpins are. So I wouldn't recommend doing it. But if you're trying to manage for monarch butterflies, you have to manage not only for the eastern United States, for their winter range, or for their summer range, but also parts of Mexico for their winter range. So it can be problematic from that aspect. With dispersal, right, here, when we think about reasons for it, one big thing that's important with dispersal is that we avoid inbreeding, right? So typically what happens is males will leave and go to another population, okay? So they can find females that are not their siblings or not their cousins. Very, very, very important. It keeps the genetic diversity high. Now, there are two kinds of dispersal. We'll call them natal and breeding dispersal. Natal dispersal is movement from the range where you were born to a range where you reproduce. Okay. Breeding dispersal is movement to a new range between reproductive events. They're not particularly important differences for our purposes, but they do exist. It's tricky to study this, though, because it obviously involves individuals. And so being able to GPS or radio tag can be a help. We can use genetic methods. If we get samples from all of our subpopulations, we can easily trace where individual genes are going and thus where dispersal is going. Like I said, it's usually biased by sex, right? And with mammals, our primary management target, it's males, okay? If you are managing for birds, the opposite is true. Females usually disperse and males usually stick around at home. The reason behind that is that where we have dispersal in birds, it's usually territory-based, and so a male is more likely to stick around in the good territory to try to inherit it from his dad. With mammals, that's really not usually the concern. There are cases where both sexes will disperse, not super common, but when it does happen, usually one species or the other goes farther and is the primary disperser. And there are 3 stages to dispersal: emigration, transfer, and immigration. So emigration is when you leave, right? You say, I'm had it with this town, I'm leaving, you pack your stuff up in your car and you drive away. Okay. Now, the next part of this, you don't really know where you're going, right? This is transfer. You've never lived there before. You're not sure what's here, right? So you might turn around, right? You might get scared. You might turn around. You say, I'm not running away after all. I'm going back home. And this is problematic for us because we see a lot of what we call test drives, right? A lot of animals that are going to disperse will take little trips out just to kind of see what it's like and come back. Come out, come back. There are also failed attempts where you set out in earnest, I'm leaving, and then you fail and you have to come back home. And it's hard to determine which of those 2 things has happened. A successful transfer leads to immigration. Okay,